Okay, let's peel back the layers on a period often dismissed with a frankly lazy and historically inaccurate label, the Dark Ages.
hmm
We're diving deep today, challenging that notion head on to understand what was actually happening in Western Europe from roughly 400 to 1100 CE.
Yeah.
This was a time of profound upheaval, no question, but it was also an era of surprising resilience, new beginnings, and foundational developments.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it, how a term like Dark Ages can actively obscure centuries of incredibly complex and dynamic history. To
Exactly.
even begin to see this period clearly, we absolutely must first confront the biases and historical agendas that saddled it with such a misleading name.
You're damn right. So consider this your mission briefing.
Yep.
We're going to dismantle that problematic label, explore the messy, vibrant reality of this era, and see what lessons this transformative history holds for us about change, adaptation, and pushing forward through turmoil.
Okay,
Are you ready to shed some light on this supposedly dark age?
let's unearth the truth.
Right. Our journey starts with understanding just how this period got stuck with that miserable tag in the first place. Where did this idea of darkness originate?
We have to go back to the 14th century, to Italy, and a figure named Francesco Petrarch.
Ah, the OG hater. Petrarch, the Renaissance humanist obsessed with classical Rome.
Precisely. Petrarch lived during the dawn of what would become known as the Renaissance. He absolutely venerated the literary achievements of classical Rome, its Latin prose, its poetry, its rhetoric.
Yeah,
For him, this represented an unparalleled peak of human culture,
the gold standard.
entirely. And when he looked back in the centuries that followed the significant troubles of the Western Roman Empire, he perceived a stark and, to him, devastating decline in the quality of Latin literature.
Okay, so it was literature specifically.
Yes, the elegance, the grammar, the sophistication he admired from antiquity seemed to have vanished.
So he coined a term for that perceived decline.
He described this period as a slumber of forgetfulness, or a dark age, where classical brilliance had dimmed. It's crucial to understand that for Petrarch, this was initially a literary and cultural critique, focused narrowly on the state of Latin letters. It wasn't a blanket condemnation of every aspect of society for 1,000 years.
But the humanists who followed him absolutely took that idea and ran with it, didn't they?
Oh, they seized upon it with gusto. The Renaissance humanists were trying to define their own era as a rebirth. The Rinascimento, a glorious return to classical learning, art, and values.
Right.
To make their era look truly brilliant, they needed a foil.
And the centuries before them were the perfect target.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Exactly. What better way to illuminate your own brilliance than to paint the preceding 1,000 years as culturally barren, intellectually stagnant, and utterly obscure?
Right, you need the shadow to appreciate the light.
It became a convenient narrative device, framing history as two radiant peaks, classical antiquity and the Renaissance separated by a vast, dim valley. It was, quite frankly, a self-serving historical argument designed to elevate their own time.
Look at us, we've dragged civilization out of the mire those guys wallowed in, something like that.
That was very much the vibe. And the narrative gained even more traction later, particularly in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment. Thinkers like Edward Gibbon really amplified the idea of this period as dark.
Given of decline and fall fame, the title says it all, really.
Indeed, Gibbon and many Enlightenment figures were deeply suspicious of, and often actively hostile towards, organized religion, especially the powerful Catholic Church that dominated medieval Western Europe.
They saw the church's rise as destructive to reason and progress. That was their whole thing.
Precisely. They explicitly blamed the troubles of the Roman Empire and the state of Europe after its collapse on the triumph of barbarism and religion.
Wow, okay. So direct blame.
Oh yeah. For these thinkers, dark didn't just mean obscure because of a lack of sources. It carried a heavy moral and intellectual judgment. It meant bad, a time intellectually oppressed by dogma, stifling reason, and the kind of secular progress the Enlightenment valued so highly.
So it morphed from a specific literary critique into a full-blown polemical attack on an entire era, driven by later cultural biases and a particularly potent strain of anti-clericalism.
That's the critical takeaway. The term Dark Ages wasn't a neutral historical description.
Yeah.
It was a construct, created centuries later by groups with specific agendas. Renaissance humanists needing a backdrop for their rebirth, Enlightenment thinkers dismissing religious influence who judged the past by their own often quite limited standards.
Mm-hmm.
They found it miserably wanting, not on its own terms, but on theirs.
And that, thankfully, is why modern historians have pretty much thrown the term Dark Ages into the bin.
With very good reason. It's deeply problematic.
Let's spell out exactly why it's such a bad term. The connotations alone are awful.
They are utterly negative and pejorative. Dark Ages implies intellectual stagnation, widespread barbarity, a complete absence of significant achievement.
Yeah, just avoid it.
It conjures an image of a void, a time when nothing happened, when in reality it was a period of intense, if difficult, change and creativity. It's a gross oversimplification based on outdated, biased understanding.
It's incredibly reductionist, too. How can you possibly take 700, 800, 1,000 years, spanning vast geographical areas, and just cram it all into a single negative box of decline?
It's absurd, frankly. This period wasn't some uniform blob of backwardness. It was packed with hugely significant societal shifts, technological innovations slow, yes, but absolutely foundational and unique cultural growth that looked very different from Rome, but was vibrant and important in its own right.
And that Rome-centric bias is a massive part of the problem, judging everything against Rome.
Fundamentally, it judges the entire era only by comparing it to the idealized peak of classical Rome. It utterly dismisses the cultures, the political structures, the achievements of the Germanic peoples, the Celts, the later Slavs, and others, who weren't just destroying Roman systems, but were actively building completely new societies, fusing traditions, forging new identities. It fails to see the era for what it was, only for what it wasn't compared to a previous empire.
Which leads to the widely held misconception that the church just clamped down on everything and choked intellectual life, like just sat on it.
A complete fantasy, heavily fueled by that Enlightenment anti-clericalism we discussed. While the church became incredibly powerful, the idea that it uniformly stifled learning is dead wrong.
Right.
Monasteries, far from being centers of oppression, were arguably the single most important institutions for preserving literacy and classical learning.
Really? That important?
Oh, yeah. Monks weren't just praying, they were scholars, copyists, artists, architects, agricultural innovators.
They were actively keeping the flame of learning alive.
Absolutely. They were the custodians of texts, both Christian and classical. Without their painstaking work in scriptoria, much of what we know about classical antiquity simply wouldn't have survived.
What about that other excuse people sometimes use that it's dark because we don't have many sources from this period?
That argument is, to put it mildly, bollocks.
Okay.
While it's true that for some very specific sub-periods in particular regions, there might be fewer written records compared to, say, the High Middle Ages or parts of the Roman Empire.
Okay, so there's a grain of truth somewhere.
A tiny grain, maybe. But that is demonstrably not true for the entire sweep of the early Middle Ages across Western Europe. We have a significant body of surviving Latin literature from the period between 500 and 800 CE. Some scholars argue we have more surviving Latin texts from that specific dark period than from centuries before the Roman Empire's peak.
That's genuinely wild to think about. More texts.
Potentially, yes, for certain periods. And written sources are just one piece of the puzzle. Archaeology over the past century has been utterly transformative, providing mountains of evidence on daily life, settlement patterns, agriculture, trade, technology, art filling in gaps where written records are sparse.
So less text doesn't mean less happening.
Exactly. A relative lack of text for a short time in one place does not mean the lights went out everywhere.
And this notion of total societal collapse across the board, you mentioned that's a myth.
A total and damaging myth. Yes, urban life shrank dramatically in most places compared to Roman levels, no question.
Yeah.
But concurrently, agriculture saw massive foundational advancements, particularly in Northern Europe, with the heavy plow and the three-field system.
Right.
These developments laid the groundwork for future economic booms.
Okay.
Intellectual life persisted and evolved in monastic centers. Distinct and incredibly sophisticated art styles flourished: Insular, Carolingian, Ottonian.
We'll get into those, I hope.
Oh, we will. Trade and urbanism didn't vanish. They contracted, yes. But they also reconfigured into new patterns and networks, often with new players. The idea of a universal blackout is simply historically inaccurate.
So the term Dark Ages is biased, inaccurate, misleading, and just plain lazy. What should we be calling this period? Let's put some better, more accurate names on it.
The most widely accepted neutral term in scholarship today is the early Middle Ages.
Simple, clear, descriptive, no judgment.
It positions this period roughly from the 5th, 6th century to the 10th, 11th century as the crucial formative phase that preceded and laid the groundwork for the High Middle Ages. It's foundational.
What about late antiquity? That term is used a lot to describe the transition.
It is, and it's a very valuable term. It typically covers the period from the 3rd century well into the 7th or 8th century. Late antiquity emphasizes the gradual nature of the transition away from the classical Roman world and, importantly, highlights the surprising continuities with Roman civilization that persisted for centuries after the traditional fall.
So it actively challenges the idea of an abrupt collapse and immediate darkness, focusing instead on transformation and blend. It wasn't a cliff edge.
Exactly. Another useful term, especially for the early part of the period, is the migration period, or in German, the Völkerwanderung.
The wandering of the peoples. Sounds epic.
That term focuses specifically on the massive dynamic movements of various groups, Germanic peoples, Huns, Slavs, among others, predominantly from the late 4th to the 6th or 7th centuries. It highlights the demographic and political seismic shifts that fundamentally reshaped the map of Europe.
So early Middle Ages for the whole span, late antiquity for the transition continuity, and migration period for the big movements. Makes sense.
And as some historians like Alden Gautier suggest, if the term Dark Ages is used at all, and that's a very big meaning, if it should be strictly limited to specific brief subperiods in particular poorly documented regions, like Britain right after the Romans left, say 410, 610 CE, even then it should only mean that written sources are scarce for that specific time and place, not that the people living through it were somehow dark or less capable.
It's about our lack of evidence, not their lack of achievement. That's a critical distinction.
Precisely. And this highlights the sheer power of the names we give to historical periods. Dark Ages screams decline. Early Middle Ages suggests foundation. Late Antiquity implies transformation. The move toward these more neutral, descriptive terms reflects a commitment to a more nuanced, evidence-based, and less judgmental historical understanding.
Seeing the era on its own complex terms.
That's the goal.
All right, let's define the boundaries for our deep dive. We're focused primarily on Western Europe.
Yes, specifically the geographical area that once constituted the Western Roman Empire. Britain, Gaul, Spain, Italy, North Africa, parts of Germany.
And the timeline. Sources place it roughly from 400-500 CE to 400-1100 CE.
That's the generally accepted range for the early Middle Ages. While the symbolic end of the Western Empire in 476 CE is often used as a marker, historians see the process starting earlier, around 400 CE, with various internal and external pressures.
And it blends into the High Middle Ages around the turn of the millennium.
Yes. The period extends to roughly 1000 or 1100 CE, which marks the beginning of the dynamic High Middle Ages, with population growth, town revival, all that stuff.
It's absolutely crucial to point out that this whole Dark Ages concept is fiercely, unapologetically Eurocentric and West-specific.
Entirely. It's a concept born out of Western European scholars looking solely at their own regional past and one specific historical event, the decline of their Rome. Applying it universally is just intellectually bankrupt.
Because during these same centuries, other civilizations were doing incredibly well, flourishing even.
Stunningly well. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome, centered in Constantinople, was a sophisticated, thriving power. It preserved classical traditions, maintained complex statecraft, and was a major cultural and economic player throughout this period.
Still calling themselves Romans.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the Islamic world was experiencing its golden age, a period of explosive intellectual, scientific, philosophical, and cultural achievement spanning from Spain to Central Asia. Baghdad was probably the biggest city in the world for a while.
So the idea of global darkness during this time is just laughably wrong outside of a very narrow, biased lens.
Precisely. The term Dark Ages has utility only for a specific, geographically limited, and even then problematic Western European context. And as we'll see, even within that context, it massively distorts reality.
All right, let's dig into that reality, because the fall of the Western Roman Empire wasn't some cliff edge at 476 CE. You said it was a gradual thing. It was a drawn-out, brutal, multi-car pileup over centuries.
That symbolic date is just the final, pathetic whimper of the imperial line in the West when some Germanic general finally said, enough. The decline was a grinding, multifaceted process that unfolded over hundreds of years, driven by a perfect storm of factors.
Let's start with the internal decay. What was going on inside the empire that weakened it so much?
Persistent political instability was a killer. Emperors dropping like flies, often through assassination or civil war, over 20 emperors in a single 75-year stretch in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Wow, 20 and 75 years.
Yeah. Imagine trying to run an empire, maintain morale, or build anything long-term with that level of chaos at the top. Trust in the state eroded completely.
And corruption was rampant, I assume?
Endemic. The Roman Senate became increasingly ineffective, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's supposed protectors, became kingmakers or executioners, even auctioning off the imperial office at one point. Effective, stable governance was a distant memory in the West.
Economically, the empire was bleeding dry, wasn't it? Overstretched.
Massively. The sheer scale was a logistical nightmare and incredibly expensive to maintain, especially the colossal military budget needed for defense along thousands of miles of frontier.
Right.
This diverted resources away from vital infrastructure, roads starting to crumble, aqueducts falling into disrepair in some places, away from innovation, social programs. Trade networks were disrupted, and ready money became scarce in many regions. The population suffered under crippling taxes and rampant inflation.
And the population was shrinking too, before the plagues.
Yes, a demographic decline had been underway since at least the 2nd century, particularly in the cities. This hit the available labor force hard, impacting agriculture and making it harder to sustain those big urban centers. Fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers.
So you have this internal rot, this weakening, and then it gets hammered by external pressures. The barbarians.
Exactly. The constant pressure from groups along the frontiers, often misleadingly called barbarians. Rome had a long, complex history of interaction, alliance, and conflict with these groups. Many served in the Roman army.
Right, it wasn't just constant war.
Not at all. But by the 300s, groups like the Goths and Vandals, often themselves under pressure from further east, like the Huns, were pushing inwards on an unprecedented scale, sometimes seeking refuge, sometimes seeking land, sometimes raiding.
And the sacks of Rome itself, 410, 455, even if Rome wasn't the capital anymore, those must have been devastating blows psychologically.
Psychologically, they were immense. They shattered the myth of Roman invincibility. And the division of the empire by Diocletian in the late 3rd century, that played a role too, right?
Yeah, how did that impact the West?
While intended to make it more governable, it ultimately left the western half with fewer resources, longer frontiers, and more vulnerability compared to the wealthier, more densely populated, and better fortified east, centered in Constantinople.
The West got the short end of the logistical stick, defense-wise.
Pretty much. It was less resilient to shocks. And on top of all this political and military stuff, you have environmental factors potentially playing a part.
Like climate shifts. I've heard about that.
Potentially. The Dark Ages cold period, roughly 300 to 700 CE, might have impacted crop yields in some areas, leading to food shortages, famine, and contributing to social instability and migration pressures. It's debated, but it's a factor.
And plagues were a recurring horror. You mentioned this earlier.
Utterly devastating. Recurrent outbreaks hammered the population. The plague of Justinian, starting in the mid-6th century, was an unmitigated catastrophe, possibly wiping out half or even more of Europe's population by 700 CE.
Good God, 50 to 60%.
Some estimates go that high. Imagine the societal breakdown, the economic impact, the sheer human suffering caused by such a demographic collapse. Fewer people to farm, defend borders, run cities.
A perfect storm indeed. Internal rot meeting external shocks and environmental catastrophe.
A complex, brutal, centuries-long unraveling. The internal weaknesses made the empire profoundly less able to withstand the external pressures. It wasn't one thing. It was everything hitting at once.
And this unraveling paved the way for the Great Migrations, which radically reshaped the map of Europe. The Volkerwanderung.
Yes, the migration period, late 4th to 6th, 7th century CE, massive movements of diverse peoples that fundamentally redrew the political and demographic landscape of the former Western Empire.
What was driving these huge population shifts? It wasn't just random wandering.
Not at all. There were push factors, pressure from groups further east. Notably, the Huns moving westward displaced many groups like the Goths. Climate change may have impacted resources in their homelands, internal population growth within the tribes themselves.
And the pull factor. Rome looked appealing.
And the undeniable pull factor. The perceived wealth, land, and opportunities within the weakening Roman Empire. Sometimes it was desperation, sometimes opportunity.
Who were some of the main groups and where did they land? Give us the highlights.
Okay, you have the Goths, famously split into Visigoths and Ostrogoths. Fleeing the Huns, they entered the empire, were mistreated by Roman officials, leading to rebellion and the Battle of Adrianople in 378, where they actually killed an emperor.
Wow.
The Visigoths eventually sacked Rome in 410, as we mentioned, and ended up carving out a major kingdom in Spain and Portugal. The Ostrogoths, under their famous king Theodoric, conquered Italy in 493.
Okay, Goths in Iberia and Italy. Who else?
Then there were the Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, who famously broke through the Rhine frontier in the winter of 406 CE. The Vandals and Alans took this incredible journey through Gaul and Iberia, eventually crossing into North Africa and setting up a powerful kingdom centered on Carthage. They even sacked Rome themselves in 455, coming by sea.
Vandals in North Africa. Okay.
Suebi stayed behind and set up a kingdom in northwestern Iberia.
And the Franks. They became hugely important, didn't they?
Absolutely foundational for what came next. West Germanic tribes who lived along the Rhine frontier, they gradually expanded into northern Gaul. Under leaders like Clovis Wurst in the late 6th century, they consolidated power, defeated Roman remnants and rival Germanic groups, and established a remarkably enduring kingdom that would become the core of medieval Western Europe.
France, essentially.
And Germany, yeah. The heartland.
And in Britain after the Romans just left, packed up and went home.
Pretty much. The Roman withdrawal, around 410 CE, created a power vacuum. It opened the door for Germanic groups from North Germany and Denmark, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, to migrate across the North Sea. They gradually established various kingdoms, sometimes fighting, sometimes displacing, sometimes merging with the native Romano-British populations.
Hence, Anglo-Saxon England.
Exactly. Later, you have the Lombards invading Italy in 568, which is often seen as kind of marking the end of the main migration phase in the West. And from the 6th century onwards, you also have Slavic peoples expanding across Central and Eastern Europe, adding another huge layer to the new ethnic and linguistic map.
So the impact was utterly transformative across every aspect: politics, culture, language.
Politically, the Western Empire dissolved into this patchwork quilt of Germanic successor kingdoms. Socially and culturally, there was immense interaction and blending, migrating groups and existing populations mixing, leading to new hybrid cultures, new legal traditions, new art styles. It wasn't simple replacement. It was a complex synthesis.
Languages changed dramatically.
Hugely. Latin evolved into the Romance languages, French, Spanish, Italian, etc., in areas where Roman culture was strong. Elsewhere, Germanic languages took root. Economic and settlement patterns were disrupted but also reconfigured. Urban life generally declined, but new rural settlement patterns emerged, laying foundations for the future manor system.
And it wasn't just simple barbarian attacks destroying everything. It was more complex.
It's vital to understand that. Rome had a long history of integrating barbarians as soldiers, foederati, or settlers. The scale increased dramatically because the Roman state was weak, less able to control or integrate these movements. And the migrating groups weren't primitive hordes. They were complex societies, often already influenced by Roman culture and military structures before their large-scale migrations.
So they knew what they were dealing with to some extent.
They often did. It was a dynamic interplay. Rome's decline facilitated the migrations, and the migrations accelerated the transformation of the Roman world. It wasn't a one-way street.
And these new Germanic successor states weren't just destroying things. They were actively building new societies, blending traditions.
Building complex hybrid polities. These kingdoms established on former Roman territory varied significantly, but they all involved blending Germanic traditions and leadership with the remnants of Roman administration, culture, and population.
Like, with legal systems, did they just impose their own laws?
Not always, especially at first. A common strategy was to maintain dual legal systems. Initially, Roman law for the Romanized population, Germanic customary law for the settlers. Over time, you saw these traditions merging, sometimes resulting in sophisticated new law codes like the Visigothic Liber Iudiciorum in Spain, which combined elements of both.
And social structures, how did that work?
Typically, a Germanic warrior elite became the ruling class, often governing over a more numerous Roman or Romanized commoner population. Governance shifted away from the centralized Roman bureaucracy towards a system based more on the personal authority of the king and his warrior retinue, his warband, essentially.
More personal loyalty, less abstract state.
Exactly.
Oh.
Economic organization moved from a tax-based state towards a land-based system, where loyalty and military service were rewarded with grants of land, the very early steps towards the development of feudal structures, giving land for service.
Religion played a huge role in this fusion, didn't it? Particularly the type of Christianity.
absolutely critical. Many Germanic tribes initially adopted Arian Christianity, which the Roman Church considered heretical. It differed on the nature of Christ's divinity. This difference created tension with the Nicene Catholic Christianity of the majority Roman population and the papacy.
So Clovis converting was a big deal.
The conversion of the Frankish king Clovis to Nicene Christianity around 500 CE was a watershed moment. It forged a powerful alliance between the Franks and the Roman Church, eased the fusion of the Frankish elite with the Gallo-Roman population, and gave the Frankish kingdom immense legitimacy within the broader Roman Christian world. Other kingdoms gradually converted as well, which generally facilitated assimilation and stability.
And even though they were labeled barbarians, these rulers often tried to emulate Roman imperial authority, didn't they? Copied Rome.
Constantly. They issued coins modeled on Roman ones, often initially keeping the emperor's image on them. They used Roman titles, patronized Roman-style building where possible, and sometimes even sought recognition from the Eastern Roman emperor in Constantinople to bolster their legitimacy. They respected the idea of Rome, even as they carved up its territory.
Can you give us brief examples of how some of these new kingdoms differed and how they blended traditions? Just a quick snapshot.
Sure. Take the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy under Theodoric. He made a very conscious effort to preserve Roman institutions and culture, ruling from Ravenna, keeping the Senate functioning, sponsoring Roman-style architecture. He saw himself as ruling Goths and Romans side by side.
But it didn't last.
No, it was ultimately wiped out by the Byzantine reconquest under Justinian in the mid-6th century. Too much division, perhaps. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, on the other hand, endured for centuries. Their conversion from Arianism to Nicene Christianity and their sophisticated law code facilitated a deeper blend of Gothic and Hispano-Roman cultures. They eventually fell, but much later, to the Umayyad Caliphate in the 8th century.
What about the Vandals?
The Vandal kingdom in North Africa was characterized by a powerful navy. They were pirates as much as rulers, but they remained staunchly Arian and often persecuted Catholics, which limited integration with the local population. They were also conquered relatively quickly by the Byzantines.
And the Franks, the winners in a sense.
The Frankish kingdoms, first the Merovingians, then the Carolingians, were the most successful and durable in the long run. Clovis's conversion was key. They built a vast realm in Gaul and Germany, saw a gradual fusion of Germanic law, like Salic law, and Roman elements, and laid the groundwork for the later development of feudalism and the eventual kingdoms of France and Germany. They had staying power.
So these weren't simply destructive forces. They were engaged in the complex, difficult, but ultimately creative process of building new societies, blending distinct cultural streams, and adapting to a world utterly transformed by the decline of Roman central authority.
It was a process of synthesis, not just obliteration.
Yeah.
A messy, often violent, but ultimately foundational process.
All right, let's talk about what life was actually like for people living through this era. Starting with the population collapse and the radical shift away from urban centers. That sounds pretty grim.
This was a defining and brutal reality of the early Middle Ages in the West. There was a significant population decline, a trend that started back in late Antiquity. Estimates suggest the population of the Western Roman Empire fell by maybe 20% between 150 and 400 CE.
Okay.
And continued to drop significantly afterwards, perhaps another 20% decline between 400 and 600 CE before the Big Plague hit.
What was driving such a steep, prolonged drop even before Justinian's plague?
The cumulative effect of political turmoil, constant warfare disrupting farming and trade, economic disruption making life precarious, the potential impact of climate variability on food production, and critically, other perhaps smaller scale but still damaging plagues. Life was insecure.
And then the plague of Justinian hits.
And it's an absolute biological catastrophe from the mid-6th century onward.
As
we said, maybe killing 50–60% of Europe's remaining population by 700 CE.
Good God. That's a level of loss we can barely imagine today. The societal trauma must have been immense.
It fundamentally reshaped everything, and one of the most visible consequences was the collapse of urbanization compared to the Roman peak. Cities, the lifeblood of the Roman Empire, shrank dramatically, or were simply abandoned as administrative centers and economic hubs collapsed. Trade routes withered.
Rome itself, the eternal city, became a ghost town almost. From 1 million to what?
Rome, at its height possibly 1 million people, maybe more if you count the surrounding area, dwindled to an estimated 20,000 or so inhabitants in the early Middle Ages. Just a shadow. Only a handful of cities, primarily in Italy or southern Gaul, maintained any significant size, and none rivaled the millions living in places like Constantinople or Baghdad.
So if not in cities, where did most people live? just scattered everywhere.
In the damn countryside, there was a massive ruralization. Settlements were typically small, scattered, often isolated villages or hamlets, separated by huge tracts of forest. Estimates suggest up to three-quarters of Europe was still heavily forested around 800 CE.
Three-quarters forest. Wow.
Population density was incredibly low, perhaps 235 people per square kilometer in areas like Britain or Germany. The total population of the vast Carolingian Empire in the 9th century is thought to have been perhaps only 10–20 million people. Yeah. Think about it, an empire covering France, Germany, Italy, with maybe the population of a modern mid-sized country.
Not many people spread over a huge area make centralized control difficult.
Extremely difficult. And this low population level persisted until around the 10th century. That sustained recovery in population and the revival of urban centers only really gained momentum later, setting the stage for the High Middle Ages.
What was the impact of this massive demographic shift to rural, low-density life?
It forced society to become highly localized and agrarian. Fewer people meant less available labor, smaller markets, less capacity for the specialized crafts that thrive in urban environments. It necessitated the development of new social and economic systems like manorialism to organize that reduced labor force on the land.
Which we'll get to.
Yes. It also made running large, centralized territories much harder, contributing to the political fragmentation we see. But the eventual population upturn, when it came, was a critical prerequisite for the later medieval dynamism. You need people to have growth.
Let's talk about that agrarian life then, because while initially difficult, farming in this period wasn't stagnant. It saw some damn ingenious innovations that laid foundation for future growth. This contradicts the dark label again.
That's a key point often missed. Yes, agriculture took a hit initially after the Roman state structures break down, yields dropped, and land reforested in some places. But from around 800 CE, especially in Northern Europe, truly transformative agricultural innovations began to spread. Slow, but transformative.
The big one being the heavy-wheeled plow, the caruca.
Absolutely pivotal. It spread gradually between the 8th and 11th centuries. Unlike the light scratch plow, the ard, used in the Mediterranean that merely furrowed the light soil.
Right.
This beast had multiple parts. A coulter, like a knife, to cut the sod vertically, a plowshare to cut horizontally beneath the surface, and critically, a mold board to turn the heavy slice of soil over completely.
Turning the soil was the game changer. Why was that so important?
Fundamentally, it aerated and drained the heavy, wet clay soils of Northern Europe, effectively soils the Roman plow couldn't handle well. It brought richer nutrients up from deeper down, and it significantly reduced the need for labor-intensive cross-plowing.
So less work, better results.
In the long run, yes. Its impact was enormous. It opened up vast, fertile new lands in the north that had been impossible to farm effectively before. Areas like the Paris Basin, the Low Countries, parts of Germany.
And led to significant increases in yields. Like, how much?
Definitely. Historical accounts, while maybe a bit optimistic, speak of fields quadrupling output in some areas after adopting the heavy plow. It often required larger teams of oxen, sometimes 8 or more, which fostered cooperation and communal ownership or sharing of plow teams among peasant villages. It also favored longer, rectangular fields rather than the squarish Roman ones.
Okay, so the heavy plow is huge. What else? The three-field system.
Another major leap forward, developing around the 8th and 9th centuries and becoming widespread by the 11th. It improved upon the old two-field system, one field crop, one fallow. Instead, you divided arable land into 3 fields.
How did that work?
One field for winter crops sown in the autumn, like wheat or rye, one for spring crops sown in the spring, like barley, oats, peas, beans, and one less fallow to recover nutrients.
How is that better than 2 fields? Seems more complicated.
It significantly increased the amount of cultivated land at any given time, from half to 2/3, more land producing food each year. It diversified crops, providing 2 harvests a year, which reduced the risk of famine if one crop failed. It improved soil health through better rotation, especially with legumes fixing nitrogen.
Ah, the legumes are key.
Very key. And the cultivation of oats was also vital for providing fodder for horses, making them more viable as farm animals.
And speaking of horses, the horse collar was a big deal for farming, too, using horses instead of oxen.
It was. Appearing around the 8th century, it allowed horses to be used much more effectively for heavier work like plowing. The traditional yoke designed for oxen choked a horse if it pulled too hard against its neck.
Right.
The rigid, padded horse collar rested on the horse's powerful shoulders, allowing it to use its full strength without constricting its windpipe. Horses were faster than oxen, meaning more land could be plowed in a day, although they were more expensive to feed.
So a trade-off, but potentially much more efficient.
Yes, and horseshoeing became more common too.
Yeah, that seems basic now, but wasn't always a thing.
More widespread from the 9th century, particularly on the harder, rocky northern terrains. Simple iron shoes protected hooves from excessive wear, increasing the endurance and load capacity of horses for transport and field work, essential for getting the most out of them.
These were hardly flashy inventions like, iPhones, but their cumulative effect sounds profound, foundational.
They were slow to develop and spread, took centuries, but they absolutely transformed the economic potential of Europe. They led to massively increased food production, creating surpluses that could support larger populations, allow labor specialization, freeing people from farming to become artisans, merchants, leading to town growth, and power economic expansion later on.
And monasteries help spread these.
Monasteries often played a key role in adopting, experimenting with, and disseminating these techniques on their large estates. This was a foundational, absolutely critical shift in economic potential, happening quietly in the fields, not dark at all.
All right, let's talk about trade. The complex, extensive Roman trade networks must have utterly crumbled with everything else going on.
They did, largely. The breakdown of the Pax Romana, the political fragmentation making travel dangerous, the crumbling of Roman infrastructure like roads and ports, and increased insecurity on sea routes led to the collapse of that large-scale, long-distance imperial trade system.
Less demand, too, with shrinking cities.
Exactly. Cities shrank, reducing demand for imported goods, and money became scarcer in many regions, making transactions harder.
Any hard evidence for this collapse in trade?
Absolutely. Archaeological data, for instance, shows a dramatic decrease in the number of Mediterranean shipwrecks found dating from the 3rd century onwards, hitting a real low point around the 8th century. Fewer ships sailing means less trade.
That's a pretty clear indicator.
Yeah. Some regional industries that relied on export, like the large-scale British pottery production seen in Roman times, essentially vanished for a period. Connections were severed.
So trade became highly localized. Back to basics.
Primarily, yes. The manorial system we'll discuss emphasized self-sufficiency for basic needs. Barter likely became more common for local exchanges due to limited money circulation. Some scholars suggest Germanic societies may have favored a more gift-oriented or reciprocal economy among elites compared to Roman-style market transactions, though localized buying and selling certainly didn't disappear entirely. People still needed salt, iron.
But trade didn't just vanish completely, it just got reconfigured, right? Found new paths.
Precisely. It contracted and fragmented, but persisted, especially for certain goods. There was still some limited trade in high-value luxury goods coming from the East, spices, silk, ivory reaching the elite, and essential raw materials like iron for tools and weapons, and salt for preserving food still had to move around.
Who are the big players keeping things moving?
Well, the Byzantine Empire remained a major commercial player in the Eastern Mediterranean, controlling key east-west routes and maintaining a stable gold currency, the solidus, which was highly valued.
And then the Vikings show up, and they weren't just raiders, they were traders, too. This is fascinating.
Absolutely. From the late 8th century onwards, they burst onto the scene. Their incredible longships weren't solely for plunder. They were formidable trading vessels, capable of crossing open seas and navigating shallow rivers.
So they connected previously separate areas.
Hugely. The Vikings established vast trade networks linking northern Europe, Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Baltic, all the way down the Russian rivers to the Byzantine Empire. They called Constantinople Miklagard, the great city, and even indirectly to the Islamic world via Central Asia.
Wow.
They founded or revitalized trading hubs, Emporia, like Dublin, York in England, Hedeby in Denmark, Birka in Sweden. They also poured huge amounts of silver, both from raiding and trade, especially in slaves and furs, into the northern European economy and facilitated cultural diffusion along these routes.
Vikings as global connectors in the north, that's a different image.
In their sphere, definitely.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, the Islamic world controlled massive territories from Spain across North Africa and the Middle East to Central Asia. They maintained extensive trade networks, including crucial links with Christian Europe via places like Al-Andalus in Spain and Sicily. Jewish merchants, the Radhanites, also played a key role connecting these worlds.
So connections existed even between rival civilizations.
Yes. And trade started picking up again more broadly towards the end of this period, around the 10th, 11th centuries.
That's when you see the real revival gaining steam. fueled by those agricultural surpluses we talked about, population growth providing more producers and consumers, and increasing political stability in many areas.
Towns started growing again. Yes, towns and commerce started to grow significantly again in Western Europe. The money economy became more prominent, replacing barter in many transactions. Merchant and craft guilds started to form, organizing economic activity, setting standards, and offering alternatives to purely rural life.
And the Italians get involved.
And crucially, Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa started to emerge as dominant players in Mediterranean trade, establishing lucrative connections with the Byzantine and Islamic worlds, bringing Eastern goods back into Europe.
So economic life took a big hit, contracted and fragmented, but it adapted. New players like the Vikings in Italian cities and new regional networks emerged, laying essential groundwork for the commercial revolution of the High Middle Ages.
A period of fundamental adaptation and the slow, steady laying of those vital economic foundations. Definitely not static or simply dark.
Which leads us to the new social and economic systems that emerged to deal with this fragmented agrarian reality. Feudalism and manorialism, systems for creating some semblance of order out of chaos, even if they were inherently unequal and often fucking brutal for the majority.
They were adaptive responses to the prevailing conditions. The breakdown of centralized Roman authority, endemic insecurity from local warfare and raiding, and a decentralized agrarian economy where land was the main source of wealth and power. Feudalism and manorialism emerged gradually, varying across regions, and became dominant features of early medieval society.
Let's break them down. Feudalism focused on the elite, right? The warrior class relationships.
Yes, it was primarily a socio-political system structuring relationships among the warrior aristocracy. Its core was the granting of land, a fief, or feudum, hence feudalism, by a lord to a subordinate, a vassal.
In exchange for what?
In return for the land and the protection that came with it, the vassal pledged loyalty, homage and fealty, promised to provide counsel when asked, sometimes financial aid, and most critically, military service, often specified as a certain number of days per year, maybe 40 days.
So it created a hierarchical structure based on landholding and military obligation, a pyramid scheme with swords.
You could see it that way. A pyramid. The king at the top, in theory, granting land to powerful dukes and counts, who in turn granted land to lesser nobles and knights who might have vassals below them. The lord provided protection to his vassals, upheld their rights, and administered justice within his territory.
And the church was mixed up in this too.
Oh, massively. The church became a huge landowner through gifts and bequests. Bishops and abbots were often powerful feudal lords themselves, owing military service, usually provided by knights and fiefed on church lands, and playing a major role in governance.
Why was this system so important in this particular era? Why did it take root?
Because central states were weak or non-existent in many areas. Feudalism provided a framework, albeit a messy, often contested one, full of private wars for raising armies and maintaining some degree of social order and defense in a fragmented world where rulers lacked cash to pay professional soldiers.
So it was a way to get soldiers when you couldn't just pay them?
Largely, yes. Land was the currency. It also influenced the development of the code of chivalry, emphasizing loyalty, courage, and military prowess among the knightly class. Elements of governance based on personal loyalty and rewarding warriors with land were already present in the Germanic kingdoms, and they formalized over time into this complex system we call feudalism.
Okay, so feudalism is the political military setup among the nobles. Manorialism is the economic and social system for the majority, the peasants working the land.
Precisely. Manorialism was the dominant economic and social organization in the countryside. It centered on the manor, essentially a large, largely self-sufficient agricultural estate controlled by a lord, either a secular noble or a monastery or bishop.
And most people in this system were peasants, many of them serfs. What did that mean, being a serf?
The vast majority were peasants. And yes, many were serfs. They weren't slaves in the Roman sense. They couldn't usually be bought and sold individually apart from the land, but they were legally bound to the land. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. Their lives were heavily restricted and dictated by obligations to the lord.
What kinds of obligations? Sounds like a raw deal.
It often was. They owed labor service, working several days a week on the lord's personal land, his domain, cultivating his crops for his profit. They paid rent, often in the form of a share of the produce from their own allotted strips of land. They had to use the lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, his wine press, and pay fees for the privilege. Various other dues and taxes could be levied.
And what did they get in return?
They received a plot of land, usually strips scattered in the manor's open fields, for their own subsistence. And, theoretically, they received the lord's protection from bandits, from other lords, or sometimes cynically, protection from the lord's own knights. They also had access to the common lands for grazing animals or gathering firewood.
And the manor aimed for self-sufficiency. Didn't rely on outside trade much.
That was the ideal, especially in the earlier centuries when trade was riskier and more limited. The goal was to produce most of what was needed: food, beer, basic clothing, simple tools right there on the estate. This reduced vulnerability. The lord, or his representative, a steward or reeve, administered local justice in the manor court and collected dues from the manor house, which often served as a fortified administrative center for the estate.
So these systems, feudalism and manorialism, were hierarchical and often pretty damn exploitative for the peasants, but they provided a functional framework for survival, defense, and economic organization in a very difficult, insecure time.
They were adaptive and functional for the specific conditions of the early Middle Ages. They provided a degree of defense, a system of justice, however local and biased, and a means of agricultural production when central state structures were absent or weak. Their eventual decline from the High Middle Ages onwards was linked to the revival of the money economy, allowing lords to hire soldiers and peasants to pay rent in cash. The growth of towns offering peasants alternatives and freedom, the rise of stronger monarchies with their own legal systems and armies, and later seismic events like the Black Death drastically altering the labor supply and empowering peasants. Okay, fascinating systems born of necessity. Let's shift gears and talk about culture and intellect. Because the Dark Ages label suggests everything went dark intellectually and artistically, which we know is total nonsense. Classical learning didn't die. It went underground, you could say, primarily to monasteries. That's the damn truth. While widespread literacy certainly declined compared to the Roman Empire, the collapse of urban centers and state-run schools meant far fewer people outside the church could read and write. Learning didn't vanish. It became concentrated.
Where was it concentrated? Who could read?
Almost entirely within the church, and crucially within monasteries. Monks, and to a lesser extent nuns, were among the very few consistently literate groups. The Benedictine rule, which became the dominant form of monastic life by the 9th century, actually required daily reading, Lectio Divina, and study as core parts of the monastic routine.
So reading was part of the job description for a monk.
Absolutely. It fostered an environment where literacy and learning were essential components of religious life and service to God.
And they had these places called scriptoria where they copied texts by hand. That sounds incredibly laborious.
Absolutely vital and incredibly laborious. These dedicated writing rooms were centers of manuscript production. Monks painstakingly copied text by hand onto prepared animal skins, parchment or vellum, Christian scriptures and writings of the Church Fathers, obviously, but also, crucially for us, classical Roman and sometimes Greek works, often via existing Latin translations. Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, bits of Aristotle's logic.
Why copy pagan authors?
Sometimes for their rhetorical style, sometimes for useful knowledge like basic astronomy or medicine, sometimes because the educational curriculum inherited from Rome included them. Copying itself was seen as a spiritual discipline, a worthy form of labor, a way to fight idleness and serve God by preserving His word and useful knowledge.
And they built libraries to keep these precious manuscripts.
Yes, monasteries accumulated libraries, housing their growing collections. Some, like St. Gall in Switzerland or Bobbio in Italy, became famous centers of learning with extensive holdings for the time. Networks developed where monasteries would borrow and lend manuscripts for copying, slowly rebuilding the stock of available texts.
And these monastic and later cathedral schools were the main educational centers, the only schools around.
They were pretty much the only game in town for formal education for centuries.
Yeah.
They primarily trained clergy boys intended for the priesthood or monastic life, oblates. Sometimes they admitted external students, perhaps sons of local nobility.
What did they teach?
The curriculum was based on the classical 7 liberal arts. The trivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, focused on language and argument, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, focused on mathematics and the natural world, all adapted and subordinated to a Christian context and used primarily to understand scripture and theology. Latin remained the universal language of scholarship across Western Europe.
So the Benedictine rule, with its emphasis on work, prayer, and study, was critical for creating this stable environment for learning.
Hugely influential. Its emphasis on a balanced, ordered, disciplined life provided the structure necessary for the careful, slow, demanding work of manuscript production and intellectual pursuit amidst the surrounding turmoil.
And they weren't just passively copying like machines, they were engaging with the texts, interpreting them.
Absolutely. Monastic scholars added glosses, notes in the margins, wrote commentaries explaining difficult passages, and compiled summaries. They actively filtered and reinterpreted classical knowledge through a Christian worldview. The texts they chose to preserve and copy were often selected based on their perceived compatibility or utility for Christian doctrine and education. It wasn't a neutral preservation. It was an active curation.
The legacy is that the classical knowledge we inherited from this era was curated and transformed through this monastic filter.
Yes, it wasn't a perfect, complete transmission by any means. Much was lost, and what survived was reshaped. But without the dedication of monastic scholars, the cultural break with the classical past would have been far more profound, maybe catastrophic. They were, in a very real sense, the intellectual custodians and bridge builders of Western Europe during this turbulent period. Unsung heroes of preservation.
And there were specific brilliant minds acting as these bridges between worlds. Let's highlight a few key intellectuals who kept the lights on.
Absolutely. Figures who preserved, synthesized, and adapted classical and patristic thought for a new Christian European landscape. We have to start with St. Augustine of Hippo, though technically living during late antiquity. He died in 430. His work utterly shaped medieval thought for the next 1,000 years. He masterfully synthesized Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy with Christian doctrine. His works like City of God provided a foundational intellectual and theological framework for centuries.
Can't overstate Augustine. Who else? Boethius sounds important.
Critically important, an early 6th century Roman senator working under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric in Italy. Boethius had this amazing ambition. He set out to translate all of Plato and Aristotle from Greek into Latin so the West wouldn't lose them.
Did he manage it?
Sadly, no. He was executed for treason before he got very far. But he did finish translating Aristotle's key works on logic, the Organon. And those translations became the standard logic textbooks for Western Europe for basically the next 600, 700 years.
Wow. So he literally provided the logical toolkit for medieval thinkers.
He absolutely did. His own original work, The Consolation of Philosophy, written while he was imprisoned awaiting execution, brilliantly blended Stoic and Neoplatonic ideas with Christian reflections on fate, free will, and happiness. It became one of the most widely read and influential books throughout the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
A bestseller for centuries.
Incredible. Who else?
Cassiodorus, another contemporary Roman statesman who, after retiring from politics, founded the Vivarium monastery in southern Italy. He strongly emphasized the importance of copying manuscripts, both sacred and secular, and compiled his own guide, the Institutiones, outlining a program for monastic learning. Then there's Isidore of Seville, a bishop in Visigothic Spain in the early 7th century. He compiled the Etymologies, a massive encyclopedia attempting to summarize all current knowledge, drawing heavily on classical sources. It was a standard reference work, basically the closest thing they had to Google or Wikipedia, preserving fragments of knowledge on everything from theology to farming.
A medieval Wikipedia. Love that. What about up north in England?
Bede the Venerable, the English monk from the late 7th, early 8th century, based in Northumbria, an incredible scholar. His ecclesiastical history of the English people is foundational for understanding early Anglo-Saxon England and the conversion to Christianity. But he wrote on everything: Bible commentary, chronology. He helped popularize the AD dating system we still use, grammar, poetry, science, like calculating tides. Deeply grounded in Roman traditions, but forging a new Anglo-Saxon Christian identity, a true polymath.
And then we get to the Carolingian period, Charlemagne's efforts.
Yes, and a key figure there was Alcuin of York, an English scholar whom Charlemagne recruited to lead his palace school in Aachen. Alcuin was instrumental in the Carolingian Renaissance, driving reforms in education, promoting the study of the liberal arts, working to standardize Latin script and pronunciation, and encouraging the collection and copying of text. He helped train a new generation of literate clergy and administrators.
So a conscious effort to revive learning.
Definitely. And slightly later in the 9th century, you have John Scotus Erigena, a fascinating Irish theologian and philosopher working on the continent who was rare in the West for actually knowing Greek well. He translated important Greek Christian texts like those of Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite and wrote his own highly original and complex philosophical work, Paraphysion, on the division of nature, a bold synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christianity that was maybe too advanced for its time.
So while not necessarily creating entirely new philosophical systems on the scale of Plato or Aristotle, these thinkers were crucial. They preserved the tools, kept the conversation going, and laid the groundwork for later developments.
Precisely. The philosophical landscape was dominated by Augustine's synthesis of Platonism and Christianity, with Aristotle's logic, transmitted by Boethius, providing the key analytical tools. Discussions revolved around the relationship between faith and reason, attempts to prove God's existence, the nature of universals, do general concepts like humanity really exist or only individual humans, the problem of evil. These were the initial vital steps that would later blossom into the more systematic scholasticism of the High Middle Ages. They kept the flame alive.
Let's talk about art, because the Dark Ages label implies crude, primitive art, but the artistic expressions of this era were anything but. They were vibrant, wild, and incredibly diverse, a far cry from dark.
Absolutely not dark. Early medieval art is a dynamic, incredibly inventive field, characterized by the fusion of multiple traditions. The remnants of classical Roman naturalism, the vibrant abstract patterns of Celtic art, the energetic animal styles of Germanic peoples, and the sophisticated, often imperial influence of Byzantine art. Art was created with powerful intent for religious devotion, for political legitimation, for expressing group identity.
Insular art is a perfect example of this fusion, isn't it, from Ireland and Britain?
Insular art, flourishing in Ireland and Britain, in both Celtic areas and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, from roughly 600 to 900 CE, is immediately recognizable and utterly stunning. It's known for its intricate, vibrant, and complex designs.
Like the Book of Kells, just mind-blowing detail.
The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Durrow, these are breathtaking masterpieces of manuscript illumination. Insular art generally prioritizes abstraction, intricate patterns, and dazzling color over the naturalistic representation favored in classical art.
What are the key features?
You see incredibly complex knotwork or interlaced patterns, mesmerizing spirals, stylized and intertwined animal forms, zoomorphic designs, and dense geometric motifs. Everything is executed with incredible precision and often a conscious horror vacuuming a desire to fill every available space with decoration. The visuals are intensely energetic and symbolic, even if these lack naturalistic volume or perspective.
And it wasn't just manuscripts, right? Metalwork, too.
No, also stunning metalwork. Think of the Tara brooch or the Ardagh chalice, employing sophisticated techniques like filigree, granulation, and enamel work to create objects of dazzling complexity and richness. Stone carving, too, particularly the monumental high crosses decorated with biblical scenes and interlaced patterns.
Where did this unique style come from?
Insular art is a brilliant synthesis of the indigenous Celtic Latin artistic traditions, Germanic animal styles brought by the Anglo-Saxons, and influences from the wider Mediterranean world, possibly Coptic Egypt and Byzantium, transmitted through manuscripts and other portable objects. It was a real peak of early medieval artistic achievement and hugely influential on later art, including Carolingian.
Then came the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, attempting a revival of Roman forms. How did that look in art?
Yes, in the late 8th and 9th centuries, Charlemagne and his court made a deliberate effort to revive classical learning and art, consciously aiming to emulate the Roman Empire, but a specifically Christian Roman Empire, Renovatio Romani Imperi.
Architecture reflected this ambition, trying to build like Romans.
It did. They experimented with reintroducing Roman architectural forms like rounded arches, massive piers, barrel vaults, and classical columns, often reused spolia from actual Roman buildings. The Palatine Chapel at Aachen, Charlemagne's main residence, inspired by the Byzantine Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, but with the powerful multi-storied western entrance block called a westwork, is a stellar example. This westwork became a hallmark of later Western European churches.
And manuscripts were a huge focus again, different style from Insular.
Absolutely. Manuscript illumination was a major focus of Carolingian patronage. Scriptoria flourished at imperial centers like Aachen and major monasteries like Reims, Tours, and Metz. While they often retained the intricate decoration and decorated initials derived from insular art, Carolingian artists made a conscious effort to return to greater naturalism in depicting the human figure, drawing inspiration from late antique and Byzantine models.
So more realistic people.
More attempt at realism, yes. Some styles, like those from Reims, for EOG, the Ebba Gospels, the Utrecht Psalter, are famous for their expressive, agitated, almost sketch-like lines, conveying intense emotion. Others aim for more monumental, classical calm. And crucially, they developed and standardized the Carolingian minuscule script, clear, legible lowercase letters, which was a fundamental invention for improving the speed and accuracy of reading and copying texts. Our own lowercase alphabet derives from it.
What about other arts during the Carolingian period?
They produced frescoes and mosaics, often showing strong Byzantine influence. Exquisite ivory carvings were created for book covers, liturgical objects, and reliquaries. Sumptuous metalwork continued treasure bindings for gospels, reliquaries, liturgical vessels made with gold, silver, gems, and enamel. Charlemagne even revived the technically demanding art of large-scale bronze casting, seen in the chapel doors and railings at Aachen.
So art was clearly used for political and religious messaging, projecting power.
Powerfully so. Carolingian art and architecture were critical tools for projecting Charlemagne's imperial authority, emphasizing his role as a divinely sanctioned Christian ruler, protector of the church, and promoting the ideological concept of a renewed Roman Empire in the West under his leadership.
Okay, following the Carolingians, you have Ottonian art emerging in Germany. What's characteristic there?
Ottonian art, flourishing under the Ottonian dynasty in Germany from roughly 950 to 1050 CE, built directly on the Carolingian foundations, but developed its own distinct, powerful style. It strongly reflected the Ottonian emperor's own imperial ambitions, seeing themselves as successors to Charlemagne and the Roman emperors and their deep religious fervor.
How did they express that imperial link visually?
Often very explicitly, linking themselves visually to earlier Christian Roman emperors like Constantine and Justinian, and definitely to Charlemagne. You see this in imperial portraits that use strong Roman and Byzantine imperial iconography, globes, lances, specific gestures. They also continue the practice of using spolia, incorporating columns or carved stones from older Roman or Carolingian buildings into their new churches and palaces to visually connect with and claim that past imperial legitimacy.
And their manuscripts, were they similar to Carolingian?
Ottonian manuscript illumination is renowned, produced in major monastic scriptoria like Reichenau and Regensburg. It built on Carolingian traditions but often pushed towards greater expressive power, monumentality, and incredibly rich, vibrant color palettes. Styles varied significantly between setters, some showing delicate classicism, others, like the famous Luthar group from Reichenau, adopting a highly abstract, flattened style with schematic, angular drapery but incredibly dramatic, emphatic gestures, often set against symbolic, non-naturalistic gold backgrounds.
Gold backgrounds are very Byzantine, right?
Very much so, signifying a divine, timeless space. Presentation miniatures showing the ruler or a high-ranking cleric presenting the book to Christ or a saint became common, visually reinforcing the divinely ordained hierarchy and the patron's piety and power.
Metalwork and sculpture were also significant in the Ottonian period.
Massively important. Ottonian craftsmen produced some of the most luxurious objects for the church. Monumental crosses adorned with gems and cameos, elaborate reliquaries, portable altars, stunning book covers lavished with gold, intricate enamel work, and carved ivory. They also saw significant developments in large-scale sculpture, moving beyond small ivories. The life-size carved wooden Girocross in Cologne Cathedral is a landmark example of emotional intensity and monumental presence.
Any other examples?
The Golden Madonna of Essen, a wooden core covered in gold leaf. And Bishop Bernward of Hildesheim was an incredible patron around the year 1000, sponsoring amazing bronze, casting the famous Bernward doors for his cathedral, covered in lively biblical scenes, and a huge bronze column modeled on Trajan's column in Rome, but depicting the life of Christ. Real masterpieces of narrative art.
What about Ottonian architecture? Was it innovative?
Architecturally, it was perhaps more conservative than the other arts, generally building on Carolingian forms like the westward crypts and double-ended churches, apses at both east and west. However, churches like St. Michael's in Hildesheim, also commissioned by Bishop Bernward, show a more systematic, geometrically balanced layout with alternating piers and columns, creating a distinct rhythm and providing important foundations for the development of the fully-fledged Romanesque style that followed.
And wall painting. Did they paint their churches?
Churches were extensively painted with biblical cycles and saints' lives, although tragically few examples survive intact. Those that do, like the famous cycle at St. George in Oberzell on Reichenau Island, show strong connections to manuscript styles and Byzantine influence, often characterized by clear outlines, vibrant colors, expressive gestures, and less concern for naturalistic representation than for conveying the religious narrative effectively.
So it's crystal clear. Early medieval art was absolutely not dark or primitive. It was a vibrant, incredibly creative field driven by cultural synthesis, profound religious devotion, and potent political ambition. It fused diverse traditions, projected power, expressed faith, and helped forge new regional and super-regional identities. Lavish religious objects weren't just acts of devotion, they were simultaneously displays of wealth, status, and power by rulers and the church. The evolution of these distinct styles, Insular, Carolingian, Ottonian, shows increasing stability, a complex re-engagement always reinterpreted with classical forms, and laid the dam groundwork for the monumental Romanesque and Gothic styles that would define the High Middle Ages.
A powerhouse of creativity and meaning. Absolutely. Nothing dark about it.
Let's circle back to literacy and education for a moment, just to be clear. It wasn't gone, but the landscape of who had it and why shifted profoundly from Roman times.
Correct. Widespread literacy. In the sense it existed to some degree in Roman cities, and among the elite, though never universal, even then definitely declined significantly. The collapse of Roman urban centers and the dissolution of the state-sponsored education system meant general reading and writing skills were far less common among the population at large.
Where did it survive? Who kept it going?
As we've discussed, it became concentrated almost exclusively within the church, primarily in monasteries, and later, increasingly, in cathedral chapters associated with bishops. Monks and nuns were among the very few consistently literate groups in society for centuries. The Benedictine rule, remember, explicitly required reading and study as part of the monastic life.
And the purpose of this education was primarily training clergy, not general education?
That was overwhelmingly the main goal, to ensure priests could read the Bible and liturgical texts, understand basic theology, and administer the sacraments correctly. The curriculum, though based on the classical 7 liberal arts framework, was entirely adapted to serve the needs of Christian life, worship, and scholarship.
Charlemagne's efforts during the Carolingian Renaissance tried to improve this situation. He saw a problem.
He made a significant, deliberate effort, yes. Charlemagne and his advisors like Alcuin were concerned about the poor quality of Latin and the level of literacy among the clergy, which hampered effective administration and religious uniformity across his vast empire. They promoted the establishment and reform of schools attached to monasteries and cathedrals and worked hard to improve clerical literacy, standardize texts, like the Bible, and standardize the liturgy.
And the Carolingian minuscule script was part of that.
A direct outcome and a critical tool. That clear, lowercase script made texts far easier and faster to read and copy accurately, which was a damn important practical innovation for disseminating knowledge and administration.
What about lay education? Could nobles or merchants read?
It remained very limited throughout most of the early Middle Ages. Some pockets of lay literacy persisted, perhaps more in regions with stronger, continuing Roman traditions, like parts of Italy or Spain. Some high-ranking nobles, especially those destined for court or church roles, might learn to read, but it was far from the norm for the aristocracy, let alone the general population. Kings themselves were often barely literate, relying on clergy for reading and writing.
So it was largely an oral society for most people. Information traveled by word of mouth.
For the vast majority, yes. Life was lived in a world of spoken word, custom, and memory. Knowledge, traditions, history, law, outside written codes, entertainment were primarily transmitted verbally. Even what we might consider scientific study was often practical and hands-on basic herbal medicine in the monastic infirmary, astronomy mainly for calculating the crucial date of Easter computus, basic arithmetic for managing estates.
The role of literacy fundamentally shifted then from Roman times.
Absolutely. From a skill present to some degree across a wider segment of Roman urban society, though still an elite skill, it transformed into a highly specialized tool concentrated almost exclusively in the hands of the clergy and, to a lesser extent, royal administrators.
And that concentration gave those who could read immense power.
Huge power and authority. Literacy was essential for interpreting sacred scripture and doctrine, performing the liturgy correctly, understanding and applying law, both canon and secular, keeping administrative records, conducting diplomacy through correspondence. In a world where most people couldn't read, those who could held the keys to divine knowledge, legal authority, and state administration. It greatly enhanced the prestige and practical power of the clergy and royal officials. Literacy didn't disappear. Its function and distribution changed radically to serve the needs of the new, fragmented power structures of the era.
And the church really did step into the void left by the collapse of Roman authority in the West, didn't it? It became the new, dominant, unifying authority in many ways.
Absolutely. As the Western Roman Empire fragmented politically and militarily, the church, particularly the Roman Church, centered on the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, emerged as arguably the most important single force providing continuity, unity, a shared sense of identity, Christendom, a moral framework, and a degree of institutional stability across Western Europe.
The papacy's rise during this time was phenomenal, from local bishop to European power player.
Phenomenal and gradual, but relentless. The Bishop of Rome, benefiting from the city's historical prestige and the claim to be the successor of St. Peter, evolved from primarily a local Italian leader into an immense spiritual and increasingly secular power broker across Western Europe. By the 11th century, popes were forcefully asserting claims to divine authority over the entire church, Petrine supremacy, and even sometimes claiming papal supremacy over kings and emperors, leading to some serious power struggles later on, like the investiture controversy.
Their alliances with rulers like the Franks were critical for this rise, weren't they? Mutually beneficial.
Crucial alliances. We mentioned Clovis's conversion. Later, Pope Stephen II, seeking help against the Lombards, led to Pepin the Short's intervention and his donation of lands in central Italy to the papacy in the 750s, creating the foundation of the Papal States. This gave the Pope territorial sovereignty and independence.
And the big one, Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne emperor on Christmas Day, 800 CE.
A watershed moment. It massively boosted papal prestige. The Pope was now an emperor maker, and created a powerful ideological link, a revived, though different, Roman Empire in the West, sanctioned by the Church, intertwining the destinies of the papacy and Western secular power for centuries.
And the Church had its own hierarchical structure that mirrored and sometimes competed with secular power structures.
Very much so. A clearly defined continent-wide hierarchy. Local parishes serving the villages, grouped into dioceses overseen by bishops, often based in old Roman cities, which were grouped into provinces led by archbishops, all ultimately looking, with varying degrees of obedience, to the Pope in Rome. Bishops often became incredibly powerful local figures, sometimes taking over civic administrative functions in cities where Roman government had vanished.
And bishops and abbots were major landowners.
Huge landowners, and, as we noted, often acted as feudal lords, deeply embedded in the secular socio-political and economic game, controlling vast resources and wielding considerable influence.
And the monastic movement saw huge growth and influence during this time. Lots of monasteries popping up.
Massive growth and profound influence. Monasticism became a defining feature of the era. While different forms existed, like the Eremitic tradition, the Cenobitic communal form, particularly following the rule of St. Benedict, became dominant in the West by the 9th century. It structured communal life around prayer, manual labor, study, and vows of stability, obedience, poverty, and chastity.
What functions did monasteries serve beyond preserving learning? They did a lot, right?
It did everything. Intense prayer and liturgical observance were central, seen as vital work for the salvation of society. But there were also major economic engines, large-scale landowners, pioneers in agricultural techniques, clearing forests, draining swamps, improving farming methods, managing mills and workshops. They served as centers of charity for the poor and sick, provided hospitality for travelers, essential in a world with few inns, and sometimes offered rudimentary schooling.
They were powerful institutions.
Due to their accumulated wealth, from donations and their own productivity, their land holdings, their organization, and the immense spiritual prestige they held, monasteries wielded significant economic and political influence. Reform movements, like the one starting at Cluny in the 10th century, aimed to restore strict Benedictine observance, emphasize the liturgy, and achieve greater independence from control by local lords and bishops, which further boosted the Church's overall spiritual authority and centralization under the papacy.
So the Church was far more than just a religious institution dealing with the afterlife.
It was a parallel power structure, arguably the most coherent and widespread structure in Western Europe for much of this period. It had its own hierarchy reaching into every village, its own sophisticated legal system, canon law, governing areas like marriage and inheritance, its own massive economic base, vast land holdings, the right to collect tithes, a 10% tax on produce, and its own administrative apparatus staffed by the literate clergy. In a fragmented political world, the Church provided a degree of order, continuity, and a unifying ideological framework that no other institution could match. It became a fundamental pillar of early medieval society, profoundly intertwined with every aspect of life.
And a central project for this powerful church was Christianizing the rest of Europe, converting the remaining pagan groups. That must have been a huge undertaking.
Absolutely central, a long, complex, and often difficult process spanning centuries. Converting the remaining pagan peoples, the Germanic groups who hadn't converted earlier, like the Saxons, the Slavs moving into Central and Eastern Europe, the Scandinavians, Vikings, the Baltic peoples, parts of the Celtic world, still holding on to older traditions.
What were the primary methods used? How did they actually do it?
Several approaches were used, often in combination. Missionaries were the front lines, the pioneers. Popes often sponsored missions, think Pope Gregory the Great, sending Augustine to convert the Anglo-Saxons in Kent in 597. Monks, both those following Roman traditions and those from the vibrant independent Celtic church, like St. Patrick in Ireland, Columbanus founding monasteries on the continent, St. Boniface cutting down the sacred oak of Thor in Germany, were absolutely pivotal. They preached, debated, established churches and monasteries that served as centers of conversion, literacy, and Roman culture.
And the top-down approach sounds pretty strategic. Convert the guy in charge first.
It was a common and often effective strategy. Focus efforts on converting the ruler or the local nobility first. Once the king or chief converted, as with Clovis of the Franks or Ethelbert of Kent, his people were often expected, or sometimes strongly encouraged or even pressured, to follow suit. Royal patronage was then essential for establishing bishoprics, funding monasteries, protecting missionaries, and enforcing Christian practice.
Did they ever try to blend pagan practices with Christian ones to make it easier? Adaptation and syncretism?
Yes, that was often a pragmatic approach, especially early on. Missionaries and church authorities sometimes consciously incorporated or reinterpreted existing pagan beliefs, practices, or even sacred sites to ease the transition. Pope Gregory I famously advised Augustine in Britain not to simply destroy pagan temples, but to purify them, remove the idols, and rededicate them for Christian worship. Christian festivals were often deliberately set to coincide with the dates or seasons of older pagan celebrations.
But that could lead to confusion, right? Old ways sneaking back in.
Absolutely. This policy could smooth the transition, but also resulted in considerable syncretism, where pre-Christian beliefs and magical practices survived, sometimes for centuries, beneath a thin veneer of official Christianity, particularly in rural areas far from centers of church authority. Folk religion remained potent.
But it wasn't always peaceful persuasion or gentle adaptation, was it? Coercion and force were definitely used sometimes. This wasn't all happy conversion stories.
Absolutely not. Conversion was by no means always a gentle, voluntary affair based purely on theological conviction. Conquest often led directly to the imposition of Christianity on the defeated population as a matter of policy. Charlemagne's brutal, decades-long campaigns against the pagan Saxons in Germany involved forced conversions, mass deportations, and harsh legal codes, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxonia, imposing severe penalties, including death, for refusing baptism or continuing pagan practices like cremation.
That's pretty brutal.
It was. While church theologians generally upheld the ideal that faith should be voluntary, the reality on the ground often involved significant political and military pressure being used as tools of conversion. Resistance was often met with violence.
And converting offered significant political and social perks for the rulers themselves, right? It wasn't just about saving souls.
Tremendous practical advantages.
Yeah.
For rulers and elites, adopting Christianity offered powerful alliances with already established Christian kingdoms like Francia or Byzantium. It conferred crucial legitimacy bestowed by the prestigious and ancient Roman Church. It gave them access to literate administrators among the clergy, essential for running kingdoms, and it facilitated integration into the wider cultural, diplomatic, and emerging economic network of Christian Europe. It was often a very shrewd political move.
How long did this whole process take? When was Europe basically Christian?
It was a centuries-long process, region by region. By around 1000 CE, most of Western and Central Europe was at least nominally Christian, though areas like Scandinavia, the Baltics, and parts of Eastern Europe followed later, sometimes well into the 12th or 13th centuries. And nominally is key, genuine propic. Christian belief and practice took much longer to penetrate deeply into popular culture everywhere.
What was the overall impact?
Profound. It created, over time, a shared religious and cultural identity across much of Europe, the concept of Christendom. It solidified the Church's immense power and influence, and fundamentally shaped European ethics, law, art, intellectual life, and social structures for the next 1,000 years. But again, it wasn't a simple replacement of paganism. It was a dynamic, often messy, complex interaction. The synthesis where older traditions were sometimes crushed, sometimes subtly adapted, and sometimes stubbornly persisted in the background.
And the Church's influence wasn't just in these big picture areas like conversion or high politics. Its claws were deep in the damn fabric of daily life for ordinary people.
It was utterly pervasive, impossible to escape. The Church was a major political force, as we've seen bishops and abbots as advisors, landowners, feudal lords. The papacy itself, a formidable diplomatic and political player. The Church legitimized rulers through rituals like anointing and coronation. Popes increasingly asserted authority using powerful spiritual weapons like excommunication, cutting someone off from the sacraments in the Christian community, and interdict, suspending public church services in a whole region to discipline rulers and populations. And its economic power through land and tithes was immense.
But for the average person, how did it touch their lives day to day?
It provided the essential moral and ethical framework for existence in a harsh world. It offered a comprehensive worldview explaining life, death, suffering, and the cosmos, and importantly, offered the promise of salvation in the afterlife. The local parish church was often the absolute center of community life, the main stone building, a place for assembly, refuge, and social interaction, not just worship.
Rituals for everything.
Christian rituals marked every major life event. Baptism shortly after birth, confirmation, marriage, confession and penance, extreme unction, last rites at death, and Christian burial. The Christian calendar, with its cycle of feasts like Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and fasts like Lent, and countless saints' days, structured the entire year and the rhythms of agricultural life. Time itself was Christianized.
The local priest was a key figure.
The local priest was the main point of contact with the formal church for most people. He provided spiritual guidance, administered the sacraments, offered rudimentary education perhaps, acted as a community leader, and sometimes offered practical help. Monasteries also played a social role, offering charity to the poor, hospitality to travelers, and sometimes maintaining infirmaries or schools.
Culturally, it was the dominant force, shaping art, music, everything.
Overwhelmingly, the church was the main custodian of literacy and learning after the Roman collapse, as we saw. Monasteries and cathedral schools were the primary centers of education and book production. Art, painting, sculpture, manuscript illumination, architecture, church building dominated. Music, Gregorian chant, and literature were overwhelmingly religious in purpose and subject matter, commissioned by the church or wealthy patrons for religious contexts. The entire worldview was fundamentally theological religion, provided the ultimate explanation for the natural world, human history, and individual destiny. Everything happened within God's plan.
And it had systems for regulation and control, keeping people in line.
Yes. Canon law, the church's own sophisticated legal system, governed many aspects of life beyond the purely spiritual, including marriage, family, inheritance, oaths, and the behavior of clergy. The church actively promoted a particular kind of emotional, experiential faith centered on devotion to Christ, the Virgin Mary, the saints, belief in miracles, relics, and the constant battle against demons and temptation. And while the full-blown organized Inquisition came later in the High Middle Ages, the church certainly had methods for identifying and dealing with perceived heresy, incorrect belief, and dissent, ranging from theological condemnation and public penance to excommunication and, in cooperation with secular rulers, sometimes harsher punishments.
So to sum it up, the church was arguably the central organizing principle of early medieval society. In a fragmented, often chaotic world, it offered a unifying ideology, a shared moral code, a common legal framework, canon law, and a pervasive institutional structure that touched virtually every aspect of life, from the king's court down to the peasant's field.
It was absolutely fundamental to the era's identity, function, and worldview. You simply can't understand the early Middle Ages without understanding the central role of the church.
Okay, let's broaden our view again one last time and look at the crucial external interactions that profoundly shaped this era, specifically with the Byzantine Empire in the East and the massive earthquake that was the rise and expansion of Islam. These weren't isolated worlds.
No, definitely not. These were two forces that profoundly impacted the development of Western Europe and contributed to the definitive fracturing of the old, unified Roman Mediterranean world into distinct civilizational blocks. First, let's consider the relationship with the Byzantine Church, the Eastern Orthodox world.
This was the Eastern Roman Empire, still going strong in Constantinople, still calling themselves Romans.
Yes. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the crises that felled the West and continued as a major power throughout this period. The Eastern Church, which evolved into what we now call Eastern Orthodoxy, developed its own distinct theological emphasis, used Greek, not Latin, in its liturgy, had different customs, like married priests, and crucially, had a different, often more subservient relationship with the emperor, who played a significant role in appointing patriarchs and even intervening in doctrinal disputes.
So Rome, Latin West, and Constantinople, Greek East, drifted apart.
They did, gradually but inexorably over centuries. The seeds were sown early.
What fueled that growing estrangement? What were the sticking points?
Several factors intertwined. Language and cultural barriers were fundamental. Fewer people in the West knew Greek, fewer in the East knew Latin, leading to misunderstandings. Theological disputes arose and festered. particularly over the filioque clause, a phrase added to the Nicene Creed in the West, stating that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, which the East rejected as unorthodox and unauthorized. There were also differing views on the nature and extent of the Pope's authority versus the collective authority of the Eastern patriarchs. Practical issues like clerical celibacy, required in the West, allowed for parish priests in the East, also caused friction.
Politics played a role, too.
Big time. The Byzantine emperor sometimes meddled directly in doctrinal matters in ways the papacy resented, like during the iconoclasm controversies over the veneration of images. Byzantine imperial authority in Italy weakened, leaving the popes vulnerable to threats like the Lombards, and the emperors often failed to provide adequate protection. This pushed the popes to look westward for new protectors and allies, namely the Franks.
And Charlemagne's coronation must have been seen as a massive provocation in Constantinople, a slap in the face.
A direct challenge to Byzantine legitimacy. From the perspective of the emperor in Constantinople, he was the one true Roman emperor. For the Pope in Rome to crown some Frankish barbarian as Roman emperor in the West was seen as illegitimate, treasonous, and deeply insulting. It dramatically escalated the political and ecclesiastical tensions.
And all this eventually led to the formal split.
These accumulating differences, theological, cultural, political, jurisdictional, ultimately led to mutual excommunications between papal legates and the Patriarch of Constantinople in 1054, an event traditionally seen as marking the formal break, the Great Schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, though relations had been sour for centuries before that.
But despite the growing split, there was still interaction between East and West during this period. It wasn't a total cutoff.
Absolutely. Cultural and artistic exchange continued, especially via Italy. Byzantine art, particularly mosaics, icons, luxury silks, ivory carvings, profoundly influenced Western art, especially in areas with direct contact like Venice, Rome, and Sicily. And its prestige impacted Carolingian and Ottonian imperial art as well. And crucially, the Byzantine Empire preserved a vast corpus of classical Greek texts, philosophy, science, literature, that were largely lost to the West during this period. These would later be reintroduced to Europe, often via Arabic translations first.
Which brings us to the other immense external force, the rise and sudden, explosive expansion of Islam.
A truly transformative, world-changing event beginning in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century under the Prophet Muhammad, followed by astonishingly rapid conquests under his successors, the caliphs. Within a single century, Islamic armies had conquered vast territories, including the Sasanian Persian Empire and former Roman provinces in Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and most of the Iberian Peninsula.
This obviously led to direct, often violent conflict with Christian Europe on multiple fronts.
Hard contact, yes. The Umayyad Caliphate's conquest of the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, starting in 711 CE, led to the establishment of Al-Andalus, Muslim-ruled Iberia, which became a vibrant, sophisticated center of Islamic civilization for centuries, right on Europe's doorstep.
They tried to push further north.
Yes, Islamic forces advanced north over the Pyrenees into Gaul, conducting raids and seeking conquest. Their advance was famously halted by the Franks under Charles Martel, Charlemagne's grandfather, at the Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, in 732 CE. The long-term strategic significance of this single battle is debated by historians, but it's traditionally been seen as a key moment checking the Muslim advance deep into Western Europe.
And the Mediterranean became a battleground.
The Mediterranean Sea, once a Roman lake, became a zone of intense conflict and competition. Islamic naval power grew, challenging Byzantine and emerging Italian maritime strength. Muslim forces raided coasts, conquered Sicily in the 9th century, established bases in southern Italy, and for a time disrupted Christian shipping routes.
But despite all the conflict, there was also hugely important interaction and exchange, wasn't there? Especially through Spain and Sicily.
Absolutely vital exchange, yes. Al-Andalus in Spain, and later Norman-ruled Sicily, which retained a large Muslim population and culture after its conquest from Muslim rulers, became crucial centers of intellectual and cultural transmission, particularly from the 10th century onwards.
What kind of transmission?
The Islamic world, during its own golden age, roughly 8th to 13th centuries, had not only preserved but also significantly built upon classical Greek knowledge in areas like mathematics, algebra, algorithms, both Arabic words, astronomy, optics, medicine, chemistry, and philosophy, especially Aristotle. Christian scholars, often working alongside Jewish scholars, eventually traveled to places like Toledo in Spain after its reconquest by Christians to translate these invaluable Arabic texts, which contain many Greek works lost to the Latin West, along with original Arabic contributions into Latin.
That must have been utterly revolutionary for Western learning when those texts started circulating.
It had a revolutionary impact, reintroducing sophisticated Greek philosophy, especially Aristotle, beyond just his basic logic, and advanced science that had been largely forgotten in the West. This flood of new knowledge provided much of the intellectual fuel for the rise of universities and the development of scholastic philosophy and science in the High Middle Ages. You even see Arabic loanwords entering European languages, particularly related to science: alchemy, alcohol, alkali, azimuth, nadir, mathematics, algebra, zero, cipher, trade, tariff, magazine, and everyday goods: cotton, sugar, lemon, orange.
And trade continued between these worlds despite the conflict.
Yes. While patterns shifted and were certainly disrupted by warfare and piracy, the Islamic world was part of vast, integrated trade networks stretching from the Mediterranean to India and China. Trade with Christian Europe never entirely stopped, often flowing through intermediaries like Jewish merchants or via specific points of contact like Venice, Amalfi, or Al-Andalus. Goods and ideas still moved.
So, the early Middle Ages fundamentally saw the old, unified Roman Mediterranean world fragment into three distinct, often competing, but also profoundly interacting civilizational blocks: the Latin Christian West, the Greek Christian Byzantine East, and the expansive dynamic Islamic world.
Conflict and competition certainly defined many of their interactions, but there was also absolutely crucial cultural, intellectual, and economic exchange happening across these boundaries exchange that shaped the distinct trajectories of each region and set the stage for the complex dynamics of the High Middle Ages and beyond.
And this all leads us finally to the glow-up, as the kids might say, the transition out of the early Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages, roughly starting around 1000 to 1100 CE. It wasn't like flipping a switch, but you see a clear, accelerated shift towards growth and expansion.
Exactly. Around the turn of the first millennium, maybe a bit before, maybe a bit after, depending on the region, you see unmistakable signs of accelerating dynamism, growth, expansion, and increasing complexity across Western Europe. And it's absolutely critical to understand that the foundations for this dynamism, this glow-up, were meticulously laid, often slowly and painfully, during those preceding centuries, the ones so unfairly labeled dark. They weren't dark. They're foundational.
What were the key signs of this transition? What starts changing noticeably around 1000 CE?
Okay, first and foremost, that agricultural boom really kicks into high gear. The innovations we discussed earlier, the heavy plow, the three-field system, the use of horses with the new collar, improved crop rotation had matured, spread widely, and were being applied effectively, particularly in the fertile lands of Northern Europe,
Leading
to a massive increase in food productivity, the large-scale clearing of forests and draining of marshes to create new farmland, assorting, and the generation of significant, reliable food surpluses for the first time in centuries.
Which directly fueled population growth, right? More food, more people.
Yes, after centuries of stagnation or slow decline, followed by stabilization, Europe's population began to grow noticeably and, crucially, sustain that growth. More reliable food supplies meant lower mortality rates, perhaps slightly higher birth rates. This demographic recovery was both a result of and a further driver for the improving agricultural base and increasing overall security.
And with more food and more people, towns and trade saw a huge revival. They feed off each other.
Absolutely. Agricultural surplus freed more people from having to work the land, allowing for specialization in crafts and trade. Population growth created larger markets. Together, these factors provided the necessary conditions for a significant urban and commercial revival across Western Europe. Old Roman towns that had shrunk were revitalized, and many entirely new towns emerged, often around castles, monasteries, or strategic trade locations, serving as centers for markets, specialized crafts, and long-distance trade.
Money starts circulating more.
The money economy spread more widely, gradually replacing barter in many transactions. Merchant and craft guilds became increasingly organized and influential, regulating production, setting standards, and representing the interests of the rising urban classes. And as we mentioned, long-distance trade expanded dramatically again, particularly with the Italian city-states like Venice, Genoa, and Pisa dominating Mediterranean routes and connecting Europe commercially to the riches of Byzantium and the Islamic East.
Political stability also started to increase around this time. Fewer invasions.
Generally, yes. While feudalism certainly remained important and local warfare continued, you start to see the beginnings of stronger, more centralized monarchies consolidating their power and extending their administrative reach. Think of the Norman kings establishing firm control over England after 1066. The Capetian kings slowly but surely expanding their authority out from Paris and France, the Holy Roman emperors trying to manage their vast German and Italian territories.
And the big external threats subsided.
The major waves of external invasions that had plagued earlier centuries. The Viking raids morphing into settlement or being defeated, the Magyar horsemen being halted in Germany and settling down in Hungary had largely subsided by the year 1000. This contributed to a greater sense of security, which fostered investment, travel, and growth.
The church continued to consolidate its power and reform itself as well.
Yes, this was a period of major church reform, often called the Gregorian Reform after Pope Gregory VII, though it started earlier with movements like Cluny. These reforms aimed to address internal issues like the buying and selling of church offices, simony, and clerical marriage, and crucially to assert the church's independence from secular control, especially over the appointment of bishops, the investiture controversy. The papacy grew immensely in authority and prestige during this time. With most of Europe now nominally Christianized, the church, led by an increasingly assertive papacy, was arguably at the peak of its power and influence as a unifying force.
And alongside all this practical stuff, a cultural and intellectual awakening began. The seeds of the Renaissance much later.
The very early stages, but clear signs of renewed intellectual and cultural vigor. Cathedral schools, attached to the bishop's seat in major towns, grew in prominence and quality, attracting famous teachers and students, serving as precursors to the first universities that would emerge in the 12th century. There was a renewed and intensified interest in classical learning, increasingly facilitated by that influx of new texts, especially Aristotle's advanced works translated from Arabic and Greek sources.
New ways of thinking.
Early forms of scholasticism emerged, characterized by a new confidence in using logic and dialectical reasoning, argument and debate, to explore theological and philosophical questions, attempting to reconcile faith and reason. And in the arts, architecture became more ambitious, monumental, and stylistically coherent across wide regions, with the widespread adoption of the impressive Romanesque style for churches and monasteries.
And finally, Europe started looking outwards again, expanding its horizons aggressively.
A new assertiveness and expansionist energy becomes palpable. You see the Norman conquests, not just of England, but also of Muslim-ruled southern Italy and Sicily, creating powerful new kingdoms. The Reconquista in Spain gained momentum, with Christian kingdoms beginning to push back systematically against Muslim rule.
Yeah, and the Crusades.
And perhaps most iconic of this transition, the launch of the First Crusade in 1095 by Pope Urban II. This unprecedented mobilization of vast resources and manpower from across Western Europe to attempt to conquer the Holy Land from Muslim control demonstrated a new level of collective action, religious fervor, and military capability. The Crusades themselves, for all their complexity and brutality, can be seen as a powerful symbol of this transitional moment, a shifting European identity, a new willingness to project power externally, and a catalyst for further commercial and cultural interaction, even through conflict with the East.
So the transition out of the early Middle Ages and into the High Middle Ages, around the 1100, was marked by this confluence of demographic, economic, political, religious, and cultural growth across the board, a definite shift in momentum.
A fundamental collective shift towards a more populous, prosperous, interconnected, organized, and dynamic society. The absolutely crucial point, the main takeaway from our whole discussion, is that the early Middle Ages was not a void of decay waiting to be filled. It was a turbulent, challenging, often brutal period, yes, but it was also one where the essential elements for future growth were forged: the agricultural technologies, the social and political structures, however imperfect, the fundamental institutions and reach of the church, the preservation and transformation of intellectual traditions, the development of unique artistic styles. All of these provided the necessary foundations for the remarkable flowering of civilization in the High Middle Ages.
It was an absolutely pivotal, formative epoch. Not dark at all, just different and incredibly important.
Without question, foundational.
So there you have it. We've spent this deep dive seeing how the label Dark Ages is a damn poor, dismissive descriptor, born out of later biases and historical injustices, completely misrepresenting centuries of complex, difficult, but also creative human history.
And hopefully, we have unearthed some of the reality of this period. An era defined by the collapse of old systems and brutal challenges, yes, but also by remarkable adaptation, profound ingenuity in areas like agriculture and art, the dedicated preservation and transformation of knowledge against the odds, the immense rise of the church as a central, stabilizing though also controlling force, and crucial shaping interactions with powerful external civilizations like Byzantium and the Islamic world.
We've reinforced some key takeaways for you. The end of Rome wasn't a sudden collapse, but a complex, messy, centuries-long restructuring. Agriculture didn't stagnate. It advanced in ways that literally powered future growth. Learning wasn't lost. It found new homes in monasteries and was reinterpreted for a new world. The church became an incredibly pervasive force shaping almost every facet of life. And external interactions weren't just about conflict. They were vital avenues for exchange that reshaped the continent's destiny.
It was a period of profound, often difficult cultural synthesis, and building anew upon the ruins of the old, not simply decline and waiting for the lights to come back on. Lights never truly went out, they just shone differently and in different places.
And understanding this era isn't just for academic types navel-gazing about the past. It shows us really powerfully, I think, how societies can and do rebuild themselves after experiencing cataclysmic disruption. It demonstrates how culture, knowledge, and basic human ingenuity can persist and adapt, even when the grand structures that supported them crumble spectacularly.
Yeah.
And maybe it serves as a pretty stark reminder of just how powerful and often damn misleading the simple labels we casually attach to historical periods or even to contemporary situations can be.
It's a potent lesson in looking beyond simplistic narratives, in valuing complex, messy realities, and perhaps most importantly, recognizing resilience and creativity in the face of immense challenge. Things are rarely just dark.
So, the next time you hear someone casually toss around the term Dark Ages, maybe you'll pause. Maybe you'll picture the intricate, mind-boggling knotwork of an insular manuscript, or the sheer back-breaking power of a heavy plow turning the heavy, fertile soil of Northern Europe for the first time, or the quiet, focused dedication of a monk in a cold scriptorium, painstakingly copying texts that would otherwise be lost forever to the world.
And you might just find yourself wondering, what seemingly dark, chaotic, or bewildering periods in our own time periods may be characterized by disruption, uncertainty, the breakdown of old norms are actually, perhaps invisibly to us right now, quietly laying the damn groundwork, forging essential new elements, adapting in ways we don't yet recognize for something entirely new that future generations will look back on and build upon.
Food for thought indeed. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into an era that was far, far from dark.
Keep questioning. Keep digging into the past. There's always more to uncover.
We'll catch you on the next one.